everyone, my name is Hailey Elizabeth, and if you don't know who I am, I post videos pertaining to a little bit of whatever I want: conspiracy theories, controversial people, true crime, vlogs. So if you're interested in any of that, you can subscribe, and if not, totally chill. We are just here to do some makeup, talk some true crime, and for today's case, we are going to be talking about the case of Tracy Richter. Now, there is a lot to get through, so we're just gonna hop right into it. But before getting into the rest of today's video, I do want to give a big thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Regal Rose. Now, if you guys don't know what Regal Rose is a jewelry brand that offers so many different selections of jewelry, such as colors like silver and gold. They also offer different styles like chunky, bold, and statement, whatever your vibe is. And personally, what I like about Regal Rose is that I love all of their pieces are very dainty and classic looking rather than like doing too much, because I'm the kind of person that cannot leave the house without jewelry on. Like, I have to have at least like some sort of hoop earring or ring or necklace, and sometimes I like to mix and match those things, but sometimes it's a little bit difficult to mix and match pieces if the pieces are a little bit too much or too much of a statement. But with Regal Rose, I never have that issue. I can easily just buy any piece and I know that it'll look good with anything. I've been really obsessed with their necklaces recently, especially this brown heart one. I've also been really obsessed with this gold moon necklace, and I'm actually wearing Regal Rose's rings right now. That's just how much I love their pieces. And they offer different types of jewelry as well, such as earrings, necklaces, rings. Now, if you guys want Regal Rose for yourself, all you need to do is click the link down below and make sure to use my discount code Queen Hailey. And once again, I want to thank you, Regal Rose, for sponsoring today's video. Now back to your video. In a very small town in Iowa by the name of Early that has a population of around under 1,000 people. With their low population, it was mostly a lot of farmers and retired people that lived in this town. And since it was a smaller town, it was a town where everyone knew everyone, and the crime rate was extremely low. That is until one night in December of 2001, police had received a call from the Roberts family home. It was a phone call made by their 11-year-old son, basically saying that someone had broken into the house and the intruders had tied up his mother, and his mother was currently tied up, but he did hear 2 gunshots. This young boy that was on the phone was by the name of Bert, and he was sitting in an upstairs bedroom. He had locked himself in the bedroom, and he was up there with his 2 younger siblings, Mason and Noah, aged 3 and 1. When the police arrived to the scene, there was a lot of screaming and crying from the mother, from the children, and at this time the father was actually away on a business trip. But as soon as the police entered the home, they immediately realized that all over the living room it was just covered in blood, and laying in the middle of the living room was 20-year-old Dustin Wehde, who was a neighbor of the Roberts family. The mother, who was named Tracy Richter, was later taken to the hospital after the police had showed up because she complained of breathing problems, and the police also just wanted to talk to her and try to figure out what exactly happened. When she's at the hospital, she explains the story to the police, and she goes on to say that the intruders had broken into her house, and at one point they even tied her to a chair and attempted at strangling her with her own pantyhose. Thankfully, she was able to get out of their grasp and go to her gun cabinet, where she had shot the intruders twice but only got Dustin, while the other intruder had ran off. Now, this typically wouldn't even be that odd, you know, a lot of break-in gone wrongs happen every day, but what was really weird about this, the person that had died was Dustin Wehde, and Dustin Wehde is not a stranger to the Roberts family. Dustin Wehde is actually a longtime family friend. He had done many chores for them over the years. He has cut their grass, shoveled their snow, he's went to barbecues, he's hung out with the kids. He's always had a really close relationship with the family, and so something like this was very out of character for Dustin to do. They actually met Dustin at church because Dustin was a youth group leader at a local church. And so Dustin overall was a good kid. He wasn't the type to go out and stir trouble. He didn't really have any bad blood with anyone in the town. As I said, it wasn't just Dustin that broke in. He also had a friend with him as well, but this friend unfortunately had gotten away. Tracy gave a description of this other man, but the police can't help but notice that this is probably the most basic description ever, and instead of giving straight answers, she always gives it's either this or that. She says that he was male and between the height of 5'11 and 6'3". She says that he has an average build, looks around 35 to 40 years old, and may have dark brown or black hair. So literally the description isn't even a description. And on top of all of that, the police also found it very odd that the intruders were there for Tracy, because when the police had investigated the area, they found that there was around $23,000 worth of jewelry just laying around in her bedroom, open for anyone to take, yet all of that jewelry was untouched, yet Tracy was the one that was being targeted. Later on, they actually did an autopsy on Dustin. They found that Dustin was not just shot twice, as Tracy had said earlier. Dustin was shot a total of 9 times. This is not a crime that, you know, you just do out of fear. This is definitely passion. And so it just felt like Tracy wasn't giving them a straight answer. She was just all over the place. And so they ended up leaving the hospital that night for her to collect her thoughts. And then the following morning, while she was still in the hospital, the police had returned. And that's when Tracy gave a full story of what happened the night before. So to give a little bit of context, the Roberts family consisted of Tracy, the mother, Michael, the father, and their 3 sons, Bert being the oldest, then Mason, then Noah. At the time of the crime, Michael was actually out on a business trip, but while he was out at work, he actually got word of what was going on back home, so he immediately left and went back home to console his family. Tracy then tells the police that the night before, on December 13th, around 4 p.m., that's when Dustin came to the home. Now, it wasn't really odd for Dustin Wehde to just show up at the house. As I said, he was a very close family friend and he lived right next door. And then a little while later, that is when Tracy's friend Marie had actually showed up. And then when Marie showed up, that's when Dustin left. And Marie had been there for a while and she was actually planning on spending the night at Tracy's house because Marie's husband was also out for a business trip. So they had plans for Marie to spend the night and they were gonna have like a little sleepover because their husbands were out. But Marie actually said that that night Tracy had told her not to spend the night that night because apparently Bert had like a baseball game in the morning and she didn't want to bother Marie with waking up so early and like getting ready. Tracy was basically just making this big excuse about like a baseball game that she needed to go in the morning. Therefore, Marie couldn't spend the night, and that night Marie didn't. She said later on that night at around 6 p.m. while she was bathing Mason, she started to hear some rattling with the front door. As I said, this was a very small town where everyone knew everyone, and so typically in small town environments, you have your door unlocked all the time just because the neighborhood is so trusted. And so at the time, her front door was unlocked. And so she heard someone unlock the door and she thought that possibly it was Michael coming home to surprise her. Maybe he had come home early. And so she left Mason in the tub and went downstairs, but halfway downstairs, that's when she realized that it was not Michael and it was Dustin and a friend of his, all dressed in black. These 2 men started walking upstairs. She immediately grabbed Mason, grabbed Bert and Noah, and put them all into Bert's bedroom and locked them in there while she tried to fight off the intruders. She says that after she had locked her 3 kids upstairs, that is when one of the men had dragged Tracy by her ponytail and dragged her all the way downstairs and was on her way to the gun cabinet in order to defend herself, but on the way there, she was choked by her own pantyhose by one of the guys, like basically putting like the pantyhose over her neck and kind of pulling her back. This led to her falling down on the ground. She says that she fell unconscious for for a little bit until she woke up to the noise of the two intruders trying to break down the door that her kids were in. And so immediately when she realized that they were trying to come for her children, she immediately ran to the gun cabinet, pulled out a gun, and she began open firing. And in the end, she ended up shooting Dustin Wehde 9 times all over his body, his chest, his stomach, his legs, his arms, while this other mystery man was able to run away. Now, already, I mean, you don't even have to be a police officer to kind of realize that this story doesn't really make sense. If they were there for Tracy, then why would they have any sort of interest in the children? And also, if they were there for Tracy, then why didn't they tie Tracy up while she was unconscious? Why didn't they keep an eye on her? Another really odd thing is, how was she able to shoot Dustin a total of 9 times, yet the other guy was able to just run away? I also found it odd that Dustin and this intruder would specifically be targeting Tracy. It just made no sense. Said that she had no tension between her and Dustin. It was just completely random. But this, as you can see, is not just a random occurrence. Shooting someone 9 times is not something that you do on accident. So later on that day, Tracy is released from the hospital. Michael comes home and the family just kind of keep to themselves in the house. But since the police didn't really have that much evidence to prove that Tracy did anything, Tracy was later let go. But that did not stop the police from snooping a little bit more to try to figure out anything that Tracy was possibly hiding from them. And turns out Tracy was actually hiding a lot from the police. So a little bit of backstory about Tracy. Tracy Ann Richter was born on May 11th, 1966 in Chicago, Illinois. She was said to be a very smart girl. She got straight A's in school. She was in many different clubs and sports and was actually just overall really well liked by the school. After high school, that is when she ended up getting a full ride scholarship for radiography. And then in 1987, at the age of 21, that is when she ended up meeting a man by the name of John Pittman. It was said that right after Tracy met John Pittman, this was supposedly like the love of her life. They hit it off so well that the following year in 1988, when the both of them had graduated college, they ended up getting married. And so then after college, after they had gotten married, that is when John had suggested that they move all the way out to Denver so that he could be closer to his family, and Tracy agreed. So that is when the couple had packed up all their things and moved to Denver. And this is actually around the time where Tracy had met John's family for the first time, and what she realized is that John actually comes from a lot of money. His childhood home was really, really big. The house that he lived in, the house that his parents lived in, he drove a really nice car. Like, his family was just very well off. And Tracy definitely took this to her advantage, because one day John's parents ended up realizing that a lot of money was just being randomly taken out of their accounts. They looked back at their bank statements and they found that there had been thousands and thousands of dollars taken out of their account. There was money being taken out and put into a personal checking account. There was money that was being taken out and used on very extraordinary purchases. But as they were looking at these purchases and the purchase history, they found that a lot of this aligned with Tracy and Tracy's spending. So the family believed that Tracy had somehow gotten access to their bank accounts and had been taking money from them. And so when the parents go to John about this, John immediately defends Tracy. He says, no way Tracy is doing this. It's just so out of her character. This is not anything she would do. And so because of this, it created a lot of tension between Tracy, John, and John's family. Not only did this specific incident create a lot of problems between Tracy and John, but Tracy and John already had issues of their own, because at the time during college, John was actually studying to be a doctor. And so at this point, he had became a doctor and he was working around 120 hours a week, meaning that he barely saw Tracy during the day. Because of this lack of communication and because they just never really saw each other, this led Tracy to get a little bit of a wandering wandering eye. John would later on say that Tracy definitely had a flirty personality. She tended to kind of flirt with anyone that she wanted, even if it was in front of John. And because of this, the couple would get into pretty bad arguments, and a lot of these arguments started to turn physical. There was this one fight that they had that escalated all the way to Tracy walking upstairs, grabbing a handgun from her gun cabinet and pointed it at John. And immediately when John saw that a gun was being pointed at him, he ran away and he ran out of the house. And from inside of the house, he heard one gunshot go off. He was completely terrified to go inside because he didn't know what he was about to see. But then shortly after that gunshot, that's when Tracy comes running out of the house. She started apologizing to John and said that she's just extremely depressed, and that gunshot right now was her attempt at killing herself, but she was unsuccessful. She said that she didn't pull out the gun to shoot John. She pulled out the gun because she was going to shoot herself, which makes absolutely no sense because she literally pointed the gun at John before he ran away. And it seems like the gunshot that went off was probably Tracy's attempt at shooting John before she missed and then realized that she can't openly shoot him while he's outside, and so she ran outside and made an excuse for him to come back in. So eventually after that, Tracy was able to be calmed down, but John obviously did call the police. That is when Tracy had been admitted into a 6-month psychiatric treatment. And this 6-month psychiatric treatment actually helped Tracy a lot. She really got back up on her feet again. When she got back from her treatment, John even said himself that he saw a lot of changes within Tracy, and it was around this time where the couple had actually decided to have a child. They thought that maybe having a kid would help their relationship, make them stronger people, but unfortunately all of that hope was just thrown out the window because having a child, surprisingly, if a relationship is bad, a child is not going to fix that. It's just going to make things more complicated and a lot worse, and that's exactly what happened in this situation. The couple later had their very first son, Bert, and this made things 10 times more complicated because Tracy was feeling like a single mother. She felt like since John was out all day working and she barely saw John, that she was basically a single mother raising him. And so she ended up admitting Bert into daycare in order to help with the stress and the work pile of having a child. Now that Bert was put into daycare, this is when Tracy ended up finding a lot of free time, and she would definitely use that free time to the fullest. With this alone time, that is when coincidentally John started to notice there was a lot of money being taken out of his account, and this was money that he doesn't remember giving to people or having to lend to people. So he started to speculate that Tracy was actually stealing money from him, similar to what Tracy was doing with his parents. And so instead of just confronting Tracy about it, because the last time they got into a fight, she literally pointed a gun at his head, he just decided to hire a private investigator to see if Tracy was actually stealing money from him. But this private investigator would unfortunately find a lot more than Tracy just stealing. The private investigator had actually found that Tracy was actually very active in the dating scene, and she would go on multiple dates all day long with multiple guys. She would go to the local beaches and just hang out at the beaches. The private investigator had actually taken pictures of Tracy laid out on the beach, and she was giving and receiving massages from these groups of very young guys. She was letting these guys touch her butt, her legs, her boobs. Like, this was not, you know, something friendly. This was definitely more than that. The private investigator had to reach out to John and show him these photos, and although he felt extremely betrayed, he couldn't actually bring himself to leave Tracy because he loved Bert, his son, just way too much, and so because of this, he just kind of stood around. This did not stop John from wanting to fix him and Tracy's relationship. After finding this out, that is when he packed up all of the family's things and they all moved back to Chicago. And something really odd that I just wanted to mention was that the family actually had 3 dogs and 2 cats, but during the move, the pets just disappeared. They just like went away. And Tracy was actually the person that was responsible for taking care of the cats and dogs and making sure that they got over state lines properly. But when John had asked Tracy, hey, where's all of our cats and dogs? Tracy actually said that moving them from state to state was too much of a hassle, so instead she sold all of them to an experimental lab in Denver. And this was one of the last straws for John, but the very, very last straw for John was one day while John was at work, he receives a frantic phone call from Tracy who's saying that he needs to get home right now, something has happened, and she can't go through it over the phone, but something crazy has happened and he just needs to get home right now. And so he immediately leaves work, he gets in his car and he's about to go back home, but for some reason he just gets a really deep gut feeling that he shouldn't go home. And so that is when he calls up the private investigator and he goes, hey, do you have like a view on Tracy right now? Do you know what's happening at the house? And the private investigator says, yes, I do see Tracy, but she's not at home. She's actually on the west side of Chicago, which was odd because the family had lived on the east side of Chicago. If Tracy is all the way on the west side of Chicago and she's not even home, then why is she frantically calling me to go home? Maybe someone is already there. And so at this point, John realizes that he can't live in constant fear all the time. And so that is when in the year of 1996, he had filed for divorce. But unfortunately, just because he filed for divorce, Tracy wasn't just going to leave his life that easily. There was a huge custody battle for Bert. As I said, John absolutely loved his son and would do anything for Bert. And so this custody battle really, really took a toll on the both of them. And Tracy did not let this custody battle go easy for John. She would make outrageous claims in court saying that there was multiple times where John had actually SA'd Bert, and there was also flyers that Tracy had made. It basically said, Dr. John Pittman, if you see this man, make sure to call the police because he had sexually assaulted my child and my child is only 8 years old. He's a creep, he's a basically this entire smear campaign, and she had printed out these flyers and put it on every single windshield of the hospital that he worked at. So all of his colleagues, all of the other doctors that he worked with came out to see this flyer, and this led to him getting fired. I honestly just feel so bad for John because in the end, Tracy actually ended up winning the custody battle. She won partial custody of Bert, and after this, John was legally obligated to pay Tracy thousands and thousands of dollars every single month in child support. So not only did he lose his job because of Tracy, he now has to pay thousands of dollars to Tracy every month, where he doesn't even know where he's going to get this money from because he no longer has a job because of Tracy. John just felt constantly as if there was no one on his side and he just didn't really know what to do. The whole reason he got a divorce was to get away from Tracy, but Tracy would not leave him. And not only did this happen, but the police actually found later on, she actually had forged John's signature multiple times in an attempt to raise his life insurance policy. And this is a huge piece of evidence because if your spouse dies, you receive your spouse's life insurance policy. Now, sometimes that can be like anything from as little as nothing to something as big as like $500,000. But the only way you would get that life insurance money is if your spouse had passed away. During this custody battle, Tracy had forged signatures to raise his life insurance policy and was successful in doing so. So then in the year of 1997, now that Tracy was back in the dating scene, that is when she met an Australian entrepreneur online by the name of Michael Roberts. It was said that her and Michael started talking online with one another, and immediately after they started talking, they really hit it off. It was said that the couple was in love with each other, and Michael was actually so in love with Tracy that he moved away from his home all the way to Australia, packed up all of his things, and moved to Chicago just to be with Tracy. And the couple actually loved each other so much to the point where only 2 weeks after knowing each other, the couple got married. Unfortunately, Tracy is still Tracy, and so after a couple months of the couple being together, that is when she started to show her true colors towards Michael, and she began openly cheating on Michael often. And although Michael was aware of the cheating, he never tried to stop it. He never intervened. He basically just went about as if he didn't know that it was happening. And also, Tracy would tell Michael all of these lies about John, because during this time she was still in like somewhat of a custody battle for Bert, and she would tell Michael all of these lies, that John had SA'd Bert multiple times, that John used to physically hit Tracy, that he had like all these like police reports against him that she filed against him, which this is just completely not true. You can clearly tell by her reports and her history that she's never made a report against John. The only report that was made though was the time that she pointed a gun at John's face. And this is wild. Not only was Tracy trying to like accuse John of all of these insane things that he did to her, she for some reason just got a little bored and decided to sue her dentist for $150,000, and her dentist was also, ironically, her ex-boyfriend, and she was basically saying that Joseph Lapisa was her dentist, but also a former boyfriend of hers. But one time during her dentist appointment, she was put under because she needed to do like some sort of surgery, but she said that when she came to, she saw that Joseph was on top of her as if he was doing something to her as she was knocked out. And although she did end up losing the case because there really wasn't much evidence to go off of, Joseph did keep his job. This completely shattered his reputation as a dentist. Everyone saw him as extremely sketchy and didn't want to go to him anymore. And then the following year in 1998, shortly after losing this lawsuit, that is when Michael decided that, you know, maybe Tracy just needs a different scenery. Maybe if she goes somewhere like a quiet countryside, she'd be able to calm herself down and be the stay-at-home mother that she's always wanted to be. What he does is he finds a very small town, specifically Early, Iowa. And Early, Iowa, it was the perfect town to raise kids. It was population under 1,000 and everybody knew everybody. And so that is when Michael had packed up all of the family things and moved them all to Early, Iowa. In the year 2000, that is when the couple had their second son named Noah, and then after that, they had a daughter named Mason. Tracy and Michael, after moving to this small town, they actually started their own IT company, which actually became a very wealthy company. The family was actually pretty involved, and Tracy as well was very involved with the community, specifically the church. They went to church every single Sunday, and it was actually at church where they met their neighbor, 20-year-old Dustin Wehde. It was said that Dustin was very good with kids, and so he would often watch a lot of the neighbors' children, and that is how he got to be with the Roberts family. It started out just as regular babysitting, but then after that, he started to come over even more often so that he could do things like cut the grass and shovel the snow. Now, as for a little bit of backstory on Dustin Wehde was born and raised in Early, Iowa, so he was naturally a very quiet kid. You know, Early, Iowa is a very small town, so he didn't really grow up around kids his age. People describe Dustin to be a very gentle soul. He had very wholesome energy. His favorite things to do was just being out in nature. He loved being outside, and he also had an extremely big soft spot for animals. A lot of people that knew Dustin described him as a kid that was always smiling. No matter what he was was doing, no matter where he was at. He could simply be doing a chore like cutting the grass or shoveling snow, and he would still do it with a smile on his face. He was very involved in the community as well, in all of their community events and fairs and flea markets. It seemed like Dustin was just the type of kid that always found the good and fun parts of everything that he did, and a lot of people would describe him as very gentle, very delicate. He was also very soft-spoken. He kind of just had this very like angelic aura about him. That is why it was so crazy when the police showed up to the Roberts family home on December 13th to find the dead body of Dustin laying in the middle of the living room. Going back to the story, currently in the story, Michael has just rushed home because he heard the crazy news about the break-in. Literally the day after Tracy was released from the hospital, she was obviously under a lot of stress and trauma from the situation. But although she was under all this extreme stress and trauma, the family still pursued on going to their pre-arranged trip to Australia during all of this. And I just specifically thought this was kind of odd, because if something like this happened to you, wouldn't you want to like stay back home and try to figure out who this other intruder is? Wouldn't you still want to be working with the police and ensuring the safety of your home? That means that mystery man has full free will to just return to the home while they're on their trip. It really rubbed police the wrong way. But Michael was determined to try to figure out who this person was, who this mystery person was. So Michael had even set out a $10,000 reward for anybody who had any information or could just supply any sort of help. And another really odd thing that Tracy did is that the next day before her trip, you know, usually when you experience something this traumatic, you need time to relax, you need time to compose yourself. Before her trip, Tracy went to the local newspaper in the town, which was called Storm Lake Times local paper, and she walked into the station and just started telling her story to anybody that would listen. And now this again is very, very odd, because if something like this is so fresh in your head, why would you yourself go out of the way to put the media attention on you? Usually when this happens, you don't want media attention. You just want to heal and figure it out on your own. But not Tracy. She wanted everyone to know how much of a hero she was. She shot her intruder because they were trying to go after her children, and she was just a hero of a mother for, you know, putting her life on the line. But it turns out that actually the family going on this trip did help out the police a lot, because that means they had the entire house to themselves to investigate and take evidence and try to really figure out what happened, because they don't believe anything that Tracy is telling them. While the family was on their trip and the police had the whole house to themselves, that is when the police started to piece together a story and actually find out a lot of information about Tracy that they hadn't known before. Well, a really big thing that Tracy was hiding from the police that the police had found out was that when they did an autopsy on Dustin's body, as I said earlier, she had shot him a total of 9 times, but on top of that, they realized that these gunshot wounds were from 2 different guns. So not only did Tracy shoot Dustin 9 times, she purposely switched out guns in between her shooting him. 6 out of the 9 bullet wounds were all over his body, his chest, his arms, his stomach, his legs. There was 3 specific bullet wounds that the police found very odd, because they were on his head, but they saw that from the bullet pathway that this was taken from an above angle. So that means he had to be sitting or laying down on the ground in order for that shot to go through his head at that angle. If this was out of self-defense, why would she be shooting Dustin although he's already on the ground? It kind of seemed as if Tracy had shot Dustin, and then finally when he was down on the ground, she shot him 3 more times to ensure that he was dead. But the police didn't want to just accuse Tracy right off the bat of murder. That's kind of a bold claim to just give out, especially when there's not much evidence to back it up. And so they start thinking about other avenues, and they start looking into Joseph Lapisa, because Joseph Lapisa, she had just lost a lawsuit over him. And they also found that the sexual assault claims, like the actual court date, was coming up. And so this would be perfect timing for Joseph to strike at Tracy so that she doesn't follow through with the lawsuit. So the police start coming up with all these theories, and they're thinking that Joseph is behind this. Joseph Lapisa, he has all of the motive in the world to do this. When they bring up this theory to Tracy that it might be Joseph, Tracy just cuts them off and she says, no. It was definitely not the dentist. This was 100% the work of my ex-husband, John Pittman. And Tracy basically blames the entire thing on her ex-husband, John, which, mind you, still lives in Denver, completely far away from Iowa. So while examining the actual crime scene, police had noticed that Dustin's car had been parked outside of the Roberts' home, and inside of the car, they found a pink notebook, and in that notebook was basically like a handwritten letter, and it was in Dustin's handwriting, and it was basically like a journal entry, weirdly. And in this journal entry, Dustin would go into the very specific details about how he was hired by this guy named John to kill both Tracy and her oldest son, Bert. Now, although this was written in Dustin's handwriting, and this was basically like a confession from Dustin that this was his intention to kill Tracy and kill Bert, that he was ordered by John, there was just a lot of really odd things surrounding this note. They know that it was in Dustin's handwriting, but they don't think Dustin wrote it out of his own free will. How would Dustin even know who John is? John lives all the way out in Denver and is more of like a distant relative to the Roberts family. It's not like his name was being brought up a lot or enough around the kids for, you know, Dustin to know about him. And at this time, John had moved back home to Denver and was currently in Denver when all of this was going on. How could he even have contact with Dustin or even know who Dustin is if he lived so far away? And even weirdly, as I said, John comes from money. He's literally hired an entire private investigator against Tracy before. And if he has the connections to hire a private investigator, why wouldn't he hire a proper hitman to kill the family if that was his intention, and not some random 20-year-old quiet kid that lives next door with no murderous tendencies whatsoever or any experience with killing someone before? Like, it just makes no sense. And at this point, John and the Roberts family literally had no contact with one another. John hadn't seen his son Bert in forever because of these very strict child support things that Tracy had enforced during their custody battle. And so after reading this, they realized that not only is Tracy involved, but their oldest son, 11-year-old Bert, was also involved as well. That is when they bring Bert in for questioning into the police station, because he is the one that called in the police to like report the whole break-in that was happening, which, by the way, is also very odd as to how Bert got control of a phone, because Bert was 11 years old. He didn't have a phone of himself. So how did he get that phone in the first place? Was it just laying in his room when he was locked in there? Did Tracy purposely grab a phone and give it to Bert? So the police bring in Bert for a little bit more questioning to try to figure out what was going on, and they said that the whole entire time Bert was very, very standoffish. He didn't really talk to the police, and although his story matched up perfectly with Tracy's, the police can't help but notice that this story felt extremely rehearsed. There was huge plot holes in Bert's story, because in Tracy's story, she said that she was choked by her own pantyhose, but Bert actually said that at one point during the whole altercation, Tracy, his mother, had rushed into the room to make sure that all three of them were okay, but when she rushed in there, she actually had pantyhose in her hand. And if she was in an active fight with intruders, why would she have the pantyhose in her hand, and why would she just be opening up the door to make sure they're okay? Wouldn't she go in there, grab all of them, get in the car, and go? And this wasn't the only really odd detail about Bert's story. Bert also started to say during his interrogation that he can't help but feel that this whole thing is his fault. John had hired Dustin to kill both Tracy and him. And so in this interrogation, he feels responsible. He feels that this is all his fault, that he is the reason that his father had hired a hitman, that he is the reason that he put his mother into danger. Bert actually ends up taking a lot of the blame for his mother. He starts defending his mother and saying things that his mother is so sweet and so kind and she would never harm a soul. Same thing with the rest of his story. This part of Bert's story seems very rehearsed, as if Tracy had told Bert basically take the blame or make it seem like Tracy is this wonderful hero so that the police will be on their side and just let Tracy go. While interviewing Bert, they found that Bert and his mother probably had the closest relationship with one another versus like the other two kids. He would do anything that his mother told him to do and would do anything to protect his mother, even going down for murder for her. But unfortunately, due to all of the lack of evidence that they had, they couldn't really convict Tracy of anything because they had no fingerprints that, you know, pointed her to a murderous rage. They also had no reason or motive for Tracy to kill Dustin. And so because of all of this lack of evidence, they just had no choice but to let go both Tracy and Bert and label this case as self-defense. After this case was closed, Tracy and Michael continued to stay married, and the couple basically just lived their life per usual, you know, just as if Tracy didn't just murder an innocent person. It was self-defense, and that was the end of that. But as you have seen, Tracy, although this part of her life is over, the case was closed, Tracy cannot stay out of drama for too long, because the following year in 2002, that is when on Thanksgiving, a man was discovered unresponsive at a graveyard, and this man was later found out to be a man by the name of Brett Wehde, who was Dustin Wheaty's father. Brett had actually shot himself next to Dustin's grave and wrote a suicide note, and in this note basically said that he was completely broken by the death of his son. His son Dustin was his entire life. His son Dustin was all he's ever known. Says that there hasn't been a day within the past year since Dustin's death that he hasn't cried himself to sleep, and he cannot live like this anymore. And so that is when he decided to do what he did. In the following year, in 2003, due to the incident with Brett Wehde, that is when the Wehde family had actually filed a wrongful death lawsuit towards Tracy, but it was later dismissed in 2005. During this lawsuit, however, in 2004, that is when Tracy and Michael's marriage really started to struggle. They were fighting constantly, but at this point, Tracy started to ump up their fights and became extremely physical. She would kick and punch holes in their walls. He said that during these arguments, he had called the police multiple times, but due to Tracy's good manipulation skills, he weirdly was always the one that ended up getting arrested. Even on the calls that he made where he was saying that he was being abused by Tracy, he was always the one that ended up getting arrested, even though he's the one that made the call in the first place. He said that after he got arrested, Tracy would never press any charges, so then he would eventually just go back home, but after this, it helped nothing, and their relationship just continued this very toxic cycle. He said that during this period of his life, he lived in constant fear of Tracy. He didn't know what she would do. He always felt extremely scared to go to the police because every time he did, he was always the one that was getting accused and arrested, so he just felt like, what's the point? Many years later, Michael actually came out to a news outlet saying, quote, "She attempted to murder me several times. I had been systematically drugged for maybe a minimum of a week, maybe a little bit more, and I thought that I was having some sort of breakdown. I was off with the fairies, and I did not know whether I was in reality or a dream state, and she said that she wanted to do a trust exercise with me. She had rolled me up in a king-size cotton sheet and I fell unconscious. And then when I woke up, she was sitting on top of me and there was a plastic bag over my head. She asked me to take deep breaths until I passed out. And she said that if I did this, she would trust me forever because I would know that she could have killed me but didn't. So it seemed more like Tracy, even though she was the one that was basically trying to kill Michael, she said that if Michael had allowed her to just, you know, knock him out essentially, that he would then gain trust for her. After this, Michael really started to second guess the whole Dustin Wehde situation because this really freaked him out and it made him think, okay, if she's capable of murder, who knows what she could have done in her past. And that is when Michael himself actually finds out some information from the police that Tracy had been hiding from him. And the police had told him that when they were analyzing the house, they found fingerprints of Dustin and the Roberts family, but no fingerprints of a second mystery man. Because if Dustin's fingerprints were on like everything during the incident, obviously this mystery man, there would also be fingerprints that would show that as well, but there was no mysterious fingerprints, only people that they knew. At this point, this was Michael's last straw, and immediately when he heard this, he felt that he couldn't trust Tracy, he was scared of Tracy, and that day he filed for divorce. And as soon as Michael had tried to divorce Tracy, Tracy went out and did Tracy things. She immediately started to tell all of the court about how much Michael was a terrible father to her children and that Michael would constantly beat her and abuse her and even SA the children. Tracy even went as far as going to the police and saying that the whole Dustin Wehde situation, he wasn't hired by John. He was actually hired by Michael because Michael wanted her dead. And her reasoning for this was she said that it was extremely suspicious that when this whole thing happened, Michael just so happened to be out on a business trip. But that makes no sense because remember earlier when we had that handwritten note from Dustin, it said in that handwritten note that John had ordered Dustin to do that thing. So why is Tracy now just forgetting that that happened and now she's blaming everything on Michael? And Tracy, to top all of that off, as if that didn't make sense to begin with, she makes it 10 times worse by giving this crazy lie. He was basically talking to Tracy in his sleep, and in his sleep he had confessed to all of the crimes, and that's how she knew that he was involved. And so this is when, very similar to what she did to John, Tracy would begin a smear campaign against Michael. She started going around to the police, going around town, telling everyone that Michael was an abuser, he was crazy, and he tried to kill her and her whole family. And then the following year in 2007, that is when the divorce was finalized and Tracy had temporary custody of all 3 children. It was a huge custody battle with Tracy and Michael, but Tracy ended up, I don't know how, but she ended up winning full custody of all 3 children and basically took all the children and moved to Omaha, Nebraska. Michael actually ended up moving to Omaha with them because he said that he loved his kids so much and he couldn't bear the thought of being too far away from them from too long. So he basically took all of his stuff too and moved right down the street to where his kids were. But although the divorce was finalized and the custody was finalized, Tracy for some reason was still not done because Tracy went to the police in Omaha, Nebraska and showed them like a crime scene photo, like a physical photo, and it was basically a crime scene photo of Dustin's body. And she went to the police and told the police that Michael had planted this on her front seat, like the front passenger seat of her car, as a way to make her look bad during the custody battle. That literally makes no sense because how would that make her look bad? If he is the one who's antagonizing her, she could have easily took that photo and threw it away. and then that would be that, and then no one would know that it would happen. How does that look bad on her at all? But all of this, you know, Tracy going to the police with this crazy story would later backfire on her, because what Tracy didn't know is that behind the scenes, Michael was actually building a case of welfare fraud against Tracy, which she was eventually found guilty for, but only got probation. And then in 2010, 3 years later, at the age of 44 years old, that is when Tracy had gotten a lot of media attention, something that she had purposely done herself. She had changed her name from Tracy Richter to Sophia Teresa Karina Baroni Edwards. And so I don't know why she decided to do that crazy long name, but I'm assuming she did this because of like damage control. On top of all of that, now this is actually wild. She not only changed her entire name to that long name, she basically started her own company with her own full name as like the name of her company. And then on top of that, she started to go around town speaking in a British accent, even though she's never been to England. She's never lived in England. She walked around like speaking in a British accent and introducing herself as Sophia instead of Sophia. But during this entire time, as I said, Michael was still trying to build a case against Tracy, but not just for the welfare fraud, but also for the Dustin case as well. He felt that there were a lot of things that the police were trying to cover up, or the police just didn't care to figure out, and so this actually led to Dustin's case being reopened. The police now reopened Dustin's case, but now with new information saying that they found that Dustin was shot in the back of the head at an upwards angle while he was laying down, meaning that this was not self-defense whatsoever. Also found that when examining the crime scene, Dustin was found with absolutely no weapons on his person, and this is particularly very odd that they found Dustin with no weapons, because earlier not only did Tracy say that she saw them with weapons, why would Dustin show up to a hitman job with absolutely no weapons to complete the hitman job? Everything about it just made no sense, and thank God they were reopening it. And on July 27th of 2011, that is when Tracy was finally arrested, many years too late, for the murder of Dustin Wehde, and was checked into the Douglas County Jail in Omaha, Nebraska. He found that Dustin was shot with 2 separate guns, and both of these specific guns were actually found in Tracy's gun cabinets. But why exactly would she shoot him with 2 different guns? They figured out that possibly Tracy went to her gun cabinet and pulled out 2 handguns and started to openly fire with 2 separate guns in both of her hands. They also found it very odd that although that little note that was found in Dustin's notebook was written in his handwriting, they looked through the rest of the notebook and found that the rest of the notebook had no journal entries whatsoever. So this wasn't a notebook that Dustin frequently wrote in, it was just a random note in a fully blank notebook. And with Tracy and her history of forging signatures in the past, it doesn't really seem that far off that possibly Tracy had forged this letter as well and planted it purposely in his car. They also found it very odd how quick that Tracy was to blame Michael for this entire occurrence. It seemed like at the time of the crime she was mad at John, and so then she put all the blame on John, but as soon as Michael and her had gotten divorced, all of her anger that was once on John then got transferred to Michael, and she started to blame Michael for the entire thing, saying that he was the one that tried to kill them, even though there was a handwritten note that literally said that John had hired Dustin to do so. Like, it just made no sense how quick Tracy was to blame Michael for such a horrendous crime. During this time, Tracy, aka Sophia, was actually engaged to another man, and so her current fiance and her children and her brother, who was a police detective, was all standing by Tracy and standing by her story. They all viewed her as this heroic mother that was just trying to defend her children. And if Tracy's behavior couldn't get any more just just wild. When Tracy was arrested, she was found with name-changing documents because she had the intention of changing her name for a third time. But not only did she plan on changing her name, she planned on changing her name to Heidi Joanna Frostbaca. That's kind of like a very odd name, and that's because that name is the same exact name as Michael's new wife. Michael during this time had gotten remarried, and this woman's name was Heidi Joanna Frostbaca. Tracy was planning to change her name to Heidi Joanna Frostbaca, which I don't know what she was planning on doing with that. I don't know if she was planning on like forging documents or trying to string his new wife into like her web of whatever she was doing. And mind you, at this point, it has been 4 years since Tracy and Michael's divorce. And so at this point, Michael has moved on. He's been remarried. He's moving on with his life. He has a house of his own. For some reason, Tracy is still fixated on Michael's life so much that she was going to change her name to his new wife's name. So as far as Tracy's trial, it started on October 24th of 2011 with Tracy pleading not guilty. The prosecutors tried to explain what they think what happened, and they said at the court, quote, "The defendant, Tracy, did not want to lose physical custody of Dr. Pittman, John Pittman. The defendant did not like John Pittman. She had a strong dislike for Dr. Pittman. So the defendant came up with a plan to make it look like Dr. Pittman was involved in hiring Dustin Wehde to hurt her. Dustin Wehde was at her house on December 13th, and there was a pink spiral notebook that he was writing in. The pink spiral notebook that would contain information to make it look like it was a journal entry, although there was no dates on this journal entry. And it would show that in Dustin's writing, Dustin claims that Dr. Pittman had hired Dustin to either kill the defendant, Tracy, and their son, Bert, or make it look like a murder-suicide. You can ask Dr. Pittman himself. Prior to this, he did not know Dustin Wehde at all and had never even known he existed. It was later on revealed during this trial that through receipts and security footage, it was actually Tracy that was the one who bought that pink notebook and lured Dustin to the house that day, where she was planning on having him at gunpoint and writing this whole journal entry that she had premeditated. But during this whole altercation, that is when her friend Marie had showed up. And then when Marie had showed up, she was planning on spending the night, but Tracy had frantically made up this excuse for Marie not to spend the night. Marie ended up not spending the night that night, leading Dustin to come back to the home around 6 p.m. so that Tracy could finish what she had started. It was at this time where it was believed that Tracy had locked all of the kids upstairs in the bedroom while Tracy was downstairs holding Dustin at gunpoint and forcing him to write this fake journal entry before planting that journal in his own car. After the note was written, that is when Tracy had shot Dustin a total of 9 times before the police had arrived. Before ordering Bert to call the police and say that there has been a home invasion, and before the police arrived, Tracy had shot Dustin 3 more times in the head to ensure that he was dead. And so then on November 4th of 2011, that is when Tracy was found guilty for the murder of Dustin Wehde and immediately started bawling crying. And so you would think that this is where the story ends. You know, Tracy got convicted, she's going to jail for the rest of her life, she's going away for murder, that's it, that's the end of the story. But Tracy, as you have seen, cannot stop being Tracy. And on December 5th of 2011, Tracy was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole and made a statement to Dustin's family saying, quote, "I've gone through every what if in my head in every possible scenario on how things maybe could have ended up differently. I do believe that you deserve justice. I really do. But I didn't murder your son." While in prison, that is when Tracy started to pick up a romance with a convicted child rapist by the name of Jim Landa, and she was able to convince Jim to basically risk his life in prison and find out the location of where Michael and her children were, because at this time Tracy was put in jail, and so all of the custody went to Michael, and he was currently living with his 3 kids and his new wife. But shortly after Tracy was locked up, that's when Michael decided to take his wife Heidi and his 3 kids, and all of them moved to California as a way to just get away from everything. They can go to the beach, they have a beautiful view, and it was actually seen in a note that Tracy had wrote to Jim Landa, and in this note she said, quote, "Oh well, I hope nothing bad happens to them." In little astrophes or whatever those are called, she puts wink wink. This woman literally never stops. Does she ever sleep? Does she ever think for a second? It was said that Michael actually attempted at moving to Australia back home, but unfortunately he couldn't because due to Tracy's visitation rights, he had to stay in the US, and so that's when they just decided to move to California. And even inside of prison, Tracy was still damaging the reputation of both Michael and John, because apparently there was this website that's no longer up, which thank God. There's this website by the name of Rip Off Report, and on this website you can basically rant about any sort of person or company. You could talk about your bad experience, and the sucky part about it is that if someone is writing bad about you on this website, the only way to get that taken down so that people don't see it is if you pay a $2,000 fine. So basically it was just a website to air out all of your business, any of your business. It was a free-for-all for everyone to say absolutely anything about anyone. And Tracy, being Tracy, would go on to these websites and drag the names of both John and Michael, setting up a smear campaign against the both of them, which is so crazy to me, because if she honestly didn't want anything to do with them, or if she just didn't want the drama anymore, why would she go out of her way to change her name, move to different places, start speaking in a British accent, and even attempt at changing her name to Michael's new wife's name? Why would she do all of that if she wasn't in the wrong, if she wasn't, you know, obsessed with them in some sort of way? But thankfully in 2014, Michael, after a long custody battle, was finally able to get full custody of his children and moved back home to Brisbane, Australia, to be with his family and raise his kids in his home country. As far as the aftermath of all of this, a lot of people surprisingly actually side with Tracy and believe that Tracy is innocent, and there's actually this Facebook page called Tracy Richter Innocence to help get Tracy out of jail. And what's really kind of sad about all of this as well, this Facebook page is actually ran by Bert. At the time of the crime, he was around 11 years old. As of today, he's in his late 20s, early 30s, and even to this day, he is trying to save his mother. He's trying to get her out of prison, and he's trying to preach to everyone that she is innocent and that she didn't do anything, but it's clear that Tracy is at fault in a lot of ways. This page has around 597 members, and on this page it includes a bunch of details about the case, a bunch of details about Tracy, how she's too sweet and kind of a person to actually do something like this. At the time of the crime, Bert was upstairs with his younger sibling, so Bert himself doesn't really know what was happening downstairs. He's basically just echoing his mother's story and trying to get her story out there. And the reason why it's really sad to me is that even after all these years, even after all this time where Bert had time to sit down and think about it, he still to this day loves his mother so much that he's risking his own reputation to try to get his mother out of jail. And even if Tracy didn't do anything violent, violent, Tracy still committed welfare fraud. She still went on a smear campaign and put on flyers and then put those flyers on John's workplace, how he was abusing them and sexually abusing them. She went for her ex-dentist for another sexual abuse lawsuit that she lost. She attempted at pointing Michael for murder right after pointing John for murder. She shot Dustin with 2 different guns 9 times. That's not something you do on accident or out of self-defense. Self-defense would be taking all your kids, getting in the car and going outside, or attempting at taking all your kids and going outside to scream for help or go to a neighbor's house. But as for Tracy today, she still is in prison living out her life sentence in Omaha, Nebraska. Yeah, that is the end of today's video. If you guys found this video interesting, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe. And if you want to follow me on any of my socials, like my Instagram, that will be linked down below, as well as my PO box if you want to send me anything, and as well all of the makeup that I put on my face. So if you're curious about this lip, this eyeshadow, whatever I put on my face, if you're just watching and you're like, that's a good product, that will be linked down below. And yeah, that is all from me. And as always, I love you, I love you, I love you, and do something that makes you happy today.